The Bonaparte Dynasty would change the course of history forever through conquest, politics, and statesmanship. They would bring the spark of civil rights to Europe, carefully balance the growing blocks of liberals and conservatives, and still manage, while not as emperors, to hold political power in France to this day. This brings us to Napoleon the First, who was born on August 15th, 1769, on the small island of Corsica, which had only become a part of France a year before Napoleon's birth. He was born into the minor nobility, not poor, but not particularly wealthy either. Looking to pursue a career in military service, Napoleon moved to the French mainland to attend school, and in 1785 he graduated from a military academy, where he became the second lieutenant of an artillery regiment, where his bravery was recognized by the other soldiers and earned him the rank of corporal. He would eventually become known by his nickname Le Petit Corporel, or the Little Corporal. During the beginning of the French Revolution in 1789, Napoleon was rather unimportant, spending much of his time at home in Corsica. It was here where he became associated with the Jacobins, a radical pro-democracy group in France. Napoleon fought with the revolutionaries in Corsica, but after the Corsican president Pascal Paul's tactics almost got him killed, he went to France, where the Bonaparte family denounced Paul as a traitor. He returned to the military in France and grew acquainted with Augustus Robespierre, a radical Jacobin leader and brother of Maximilien Robespierre. As he continued to provide a valuable service, he was promoted to the rank of brigadier general. During the following years, Napoleon continued to rise through the ranks with numerous militaristic victories. However, in 1794, the Robespierres were executed, and he was put under house arrest for his connections to them. But later, in 1795, he would suppress a royalist insurrection, and then a year later defeat a larger Austrian army, leading to the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797. Requested by the Directory to attack England, he refused, because he predicted the French navy was not strong enough to take on the British Armada. However, he insisted on invading Egypt to cut off England's trade with India. He started off strong and was winning against the Egyptians in the Battle of the Pyramids, but the British Navy intervened and decimated his forces, causing him to retreat. In 1799, he leads his army against the Ottoman Syrians, but failed to capture Acre, a city in modern-day Israel. Due to instability and the uprising of reformers in France, Napoleon left his troops in Egypt and returned to Paris to support his fellow revolutionaries. In 1799, Napoleon would lead the coup of 18 Brumaire and replace the Directory with the Consulate, which would elect him to be first consul. In 1802, the Treaty of Amiens granted a one-year peace with the British, but more importantly, that year, Napoleon would be made consul for life. In 1803, he would sell Louisiana to America for $15 million in war funds. Then, only 1 year later, in 1804, Napoleon was crowned emperor. As emperor, he married Josephine de Beauharnais, but they didn't bear any children and divorced in 1809. In 1810, he remarried to Marie Louise, and they had a son who would become Napoleon II. Napoleon would become a valuable statesman in the early 19th century, and would make many changes to the French government and society that would spread throughout Europe, whether by choice or not. Some of these programs still exist to this day. The Napoleonic Code, while having obvious exclusions, was a start to the idea of civil rights throughout the continent. Napoleon would also go on to create a secular education system, taking aspects from the ancient regime, the Enlightenment, and the French Revolution. But Napoleon was not purely benevolent and would often act in his own interest. After the majority of aristocrats had been killed or exiled in the French Revolution, Napoleon decided to recreate the aristocracy, this time composed of his friends and family. He would go on to limit trade via the continental system in an attempt to weaken France's rival, England. At this point, we should probably discuss what Napoleon the First is most famous for, his time as the military leader of France. In 1800, Napoleon defeated the Austrians in the Battle of Marengo, kicking them out of Italy and successfully seizing Italy for the French. In 1805, the French fleet would lose to the British in the Battle of Trafalgar, but the same year he would see a victory in the Battle of Austerlitz against the combined Austrian and Russian forces. This battle would result in the end of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1807, Napoleon would go on to force Tsar Alexander the First to capitulate and 2 years later, in 1809, would defeat Austria for good in the Battle of Wagram. However, in 1810, everything would take a turn for the worse as Russia withdrew from the continental system, and in the summer of 1812, Napoleon would attack Russia. But Russia was not interested in fighting a conventional war. Their strategy, best exemplified in the Battle of Borodino, was to put up a small fight to slow the French troops, followed by rapid retreat. The French army continued to push forward towards the Russian capital of Moscow. Napoleon believed that capturing Moscow would mean Russian surrender, or at least bring enough supplies to sustain his army. But the French troops arrived at Moscow to find the city evacuated and burned. The French, exhausted, out of supplies, and with winter fast approaching, were forced to retreat, when suddenly the Russian troops re-emerged and pushed their advantage on the overextended French. Of the 600,000 soldiers that entered Russia, 100,000 would leave. In 1813, Napoleon would lose the Battle of Nations to the coalition. In 1814, Portugal and Spain would get their independence, and the coalition would capture Paris, forcing Napoleon to abdicate. Napoleon was banished to the small Italian island of Elba, while his wife and son were sent to Austria. Napoleon was furious, and in 1815 decided to sail back to France, convince soldiers sent to arrest him to join him, and march on Paris to an applauding crowd. The coalition would have none of this, but Napoleon would make a preemptive strike attacking the coalition in Ligny, Belgium, where he was defeated by an overwhelming British, Prussian, and Russian forces. He would be pushed back to Waterloo, Belgium, and on June 18th, 1815, make his last stand, but no one can win a war against the world. He would be defeated and sent to St. Helena, a small island in the middle of the Atlantic, where he would spend the rest of his life. This brings us to Napoleon II, who was nicknamed the Eaglet after his death, after a famous play from the time. After the French Empire was taken down, Napoleon the First gave the title of Emperor to his son, who was living in Austria. As a child, Napoleon II showed interest in the military and studied it. This worried Europe, so the Fontainebleau Treaty gave Napoleon II a new title, Prince de Parme. They then restricted him from assuming any political or militaristic positions. Even his grandfather refused to let him move to Italy and help in the revolution. Finally, in 1831, he was placed in charge of an Austrian battalion. But in 1832, he died of pneumonia caused by tuberculosis. Born as an exile in Britain, Napoleon III was a stubborn child and had to be educated by private tutors outside of school. His mother, who missed her homeland of France, tried to instill in her son a desire to return home and follow in his uncle's footsteps. Napoleon III would become the last Bonaparte to rule France. In the revolutions of 1848, Napoleon III would rise to power, being elected the president of France. The National Assembly did not like the reforms he made, so they did not allow him to run for re-election. In response, Napoleon III held a coup and took control, then held a plebiscite in which 92% voted for him to become the emperor. Then, in 1853, he held a plebiscite which made him a hereditary ruler. Now as emperor, he would start implementing liberal reforms and was a supporter of popular sovereignty. In his first year, 1852, he gave universal male suffrage. He also gave power to the Legislative Assembly, ended censorship of the press, freed political prisoners who opposed him while he was president, and gave the right to strike. Napoleon III took power of education back from the church and gave it to the government, which ruined his relationship with Pope Giovanni Maria Mastai Ferretti. Additionally, he expanded women's education, and the first female students were accepted into Sorbonne University. Napoleon III would also improve the economy. He would open up global trade, but also end famine, export significant amounts of food, making France an agricultural powerhouse, encourage business, and, in 1860, make the Cobden Chevalier Treaty, which allowed for free trade between France and Britain. But Napoleon III did have an authoritarian side to him as well. During elections, he personally put up official candidates and censored the press to push forward his political agenda. He would go on to win the Crimean War, allied with Britain and the Ottomans in order to stop Russia from taking over Crimea and gaining power in Europe. Finally, Napoleon the Third, looking for more military success, fell right into Otto von Bismarck's trap by entering the Franco-Prussian War in July 1870 without allies and with an inferior military force. The French army was rapidly defeated, and Napoleon the Third was captured at the Battle of Sedan. The Third Republic was proclaimed in Paris, and Napoleon went into exile in England, where he died in 1873. Napoleon the Third implemented many conservative reforms while he was the president of the National Assembly, but once he was elected emperor, he suddenly used liberal reforms. Additionally, he tried to mimic his uncle's success on the battlefield, but failed to do so. The Bonapartes have not ruled France since Napoleon the Third's death, but it is safe to say that the name Bonaparte has changed the world forever.